All right, let's break it down. The copper monopoly of the ancient world. In 3000 BC, someone was mining copper from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan on an industrial scale, not collecting surface nuggets, not chipping at exposed veins, systematically excavating over 5,000 pits across Isle Royale and the Keweenaw Peninsula, extracting an estimated 500,000 tons of raw copper, and then vanishing without a trace. No smelting debris, no finished weapons, no cultural record of where any of it went. Copper was the steel of the ancient world. Without it, you had no bronze, no weapons, no tools capable of building an empire. The Bronze Age civilizations of the Mediterranean, the Minoans, the Mycenaeans, the Hittites, were consuming copper at rates their local deposits could not sustain. European copper sources were limited. The math of supply and demand had a gap in it that historians have never fully closed, and the Michigan mines represent a quantity that would have filled that gap entirely. What makes the Michigan anomaly extraordinary is not just the scale of the extraction, it is the precision of the silence. Radiocarbon dating of wooden mining tools confirms active operations from approximately 3000 to 1200 BC. The exact centuries of peak Bronze Age copper demand across the Mediterranean. 500,000 tons moved. No trade network identified. No finished goods recovered locally. No indigenous cultural record of where the copper traveled. It disappeared into a gap in history so clean it almost looks deliberate. Then, around 1200 BC, the mining stopped. Abruptly. That same century, the Bronze Age collapse swept the Mediterranean, toppling the Hittite Empire, destabilizing Egypt, erasing Mycenaean Greece. Whether those two events are connected is a question archaeologists have not answered. The coincidence of timing is precise enough to make the silence surrounding it feel less like an accident and more like an editorial decision made by history itself. 5,000 holes in the ground in Michigan, 500,000 tons of copper. A Bronze Age world desperate for exactly that resource. If someone was controlling the copper supply of the ancient world from a continent that wasn't supposed to exist yet, the only remaining question is what else they were selling, and to whom. The spice routes they burned the maps for. When archaeologists unwrapped the mummy of Ramesses II, who died in 1213 BC, they found black pepper packed into his nostrils. That detail stopped researchers cold. Black pepper is native to South Asia. Getting it into the nostrils of an Egyptian pharaoh 3,000 years ago required a trade network spanning thousands of kilometers across open ocean. A network that, according to the standard timeline, had no business existing yet. The official story of global trade begins with the European Age of Discovery in the 1500s. Vasco da Gama reaches India in 1498. Columbus reaches the Americas in 1492. The world is connected for the first time, except the pepper in Ramesses' mummy predates those voyages by over 2,000 years, and it was not alone. Traces of nutmeg, native exclusively to the Banda Islands in what is now Indonesia, have been identified in Bronze Age Mediterranean archaeological sites. Someone was running global supply chains millennia before Europe claimed to have invented the concept. Arab traders who controlled the medieval spice routes understood that geographic information was their most valuable asset, more valuable than the spices themselves. They protected it the way a modern corporation protects proprietary code. Herodotus recorded their deliberate misinformation campaigns, including the story that cinnamon was harvested from the nests of giant birds in inaccessible cliffs, a complete fabrication designed to discourage competition. When Vasco da Gama finally reached India, he did not navigate there independently. Historical records show he was guided by an Arab navigator named Ahmad ibn Majid, who already held precise charts of the entire route. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, founded in 1602, was essentially the endgame of a system that had been running for millennia. At its peak valuation, historians estimate the VOC was worth the equivalent of over $8 trillion in modern terms, making it the most valuable company in human history, by a factor of roughly 10 over any modern corporation. It was built entirely on the seizure of knowledge and routes that already existed, and on the calculated destruction of the people who held them. The VOC's 1621 Banda Islands massacre reduced a population of 15,000 to approximately 1,000 people in order to enforce a nutmeg monopoly. The most profitable trade network in human history was not built. It was inherited from people whose names were never meant to survive the transaction. The library that was worth more than Rome. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar's fleet set fire to the docks of Alexandria, and the flames spread somewhere they were not supposed to reach. What burned that night, whether it was warehouse storage of scrolls or part of the library itself, historians still argue. But the Library of Alexandria was not destroyed in a single night. It was systematically diminished across 3 centuries by the people who understood that a centralized repository of knowledge was the most dangerous thing a rival could possess. The library was not an accident of scholarship. Ptolemy the Fresh Soter founded it around 295 BC as a deliberate instrument of intellectual monopoly. Ships docking at Alexandria were required by law to surrender any scrolls aboard for copying, the originals sometimes kept, copies returned to the owners. At its peak, the collection held an estimated 400,000 to 700,000 scrolls. The objective was not preservation, it was control. The same logic that built every monopoly in history applied to human knowledge itself. What that collection contained is the real story. Aristarchus of Samos, working in Alexandria around 270 BC, calculated that the Earth orbited the Sun, a conclusion not reached again in Western science until Copernicus published in 1543, approximately 1800 years later. Eratosthenes, the library's chief librarian, calculated the circumference of the Earth in 240 BC using 2 sticks and shadow measurements, arriving at a figure remarkably close to what satellite measurement would confirm 2,000 years later. Hero of Alexandria designed a functioning steam-powered device around 50 AD. The library did not just hold books. It held working prototypes of futures that never happened. In 391 AD, the Serapeum, the library's daughter institution, was destroyed by Theophilus, Bishop of Alexandria, acting under imperial Christian authority. What survived was scattered into private collections, hidden in temple walls, encoded into architectural alignments that later scholars would spend centuries trying to decode. The Antikythera mechanism, a 2,000-year-old analog computing device recovered from a shipwreck in 1900, demonstrates that the technological knowledge described in those scrolls was not theoretical. It was built, it was used, and it was being transported somewhere when the ship went down. If Eratosthenes could calculate the size of the Earth in 240 BC using 2 sticks, the only honest question remaining is what else the library contained, and who decided that the rest of us should not have it. The gold of El Dorado, and what it was actually funding. When the Spanish conquistadors arrived in Muisca territory, in modern Colombia in the 1530s, they found a ruler being covered in gold dust before wading into a high-altitude lake and washing it off in a ritual offering to the gods. The Spanish called him El Dorado, the Golden One, and spent 200 years and an incalculable number of lives searching for the city of gold they assumed must exist somewhere behind that ceremony. They were looking for the wrong asset entirely. The Muisca Zipa performed the El Dorado ritual at Lake Guatavita as a form of spiritual banking, an economy where ceremonial destruction of wealth maintained divine favor that underwrote the entire social and agricultural system. Spanish attempts to drain Lake Guatavita in 1545, 1580, and 1898 recovered enough gold to confirm that enormous quantities remain on the lake floor, but the clay walls of the lake collapsed before the deepest deposits were reached. Modern sonar surveys suggest what remains would be worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The gold was always there. The Spanish simply could not get it out, because they had already destroyed the civilization that knew how. The Muisca operated a sophisticated trade network spanning over 1,000 kilometers, moving gold, emeralds, textiles, and one commodity that was strategically more valuable than any of them: salt. The mines at Zipaquira, the same site that now contains the famous Salt Cathedral, gave the Muisca a regional monopoly over food preservation, the difference between a civilization that could survive winter and one that could not. Colombian emeralds, controlled by the Muisca, and still considered the finest quality in the world, came from geological formations the Muisca had been identifying and working for centuries before any European geologist arrived to explain how emerald deposits form. The Spanish seized the gold and let the salt infrastructure decay. They extracted the decorative asset and dismantled the productive one. The privateers who followed, Francis Drake, Henry Morgan, spent their careers intercepting Spanish treasure fleets carrying New World gold back to Europe, which means they were fighting over the symptom of a looting operation, not the cause. The real investment, the salt monopoly, the emerald supply chain, the agricultural knowledge embedded in generations of Muisca land management, was gone before anyone understood it had existed. The Spanish did not find El Dorado. They destroyed it, and then spent 200 years searching for the ruins of what they had already burned. The Silk Road's secret, what was really being traded. By 700 AD, at the height of the Tang dynasty's dominance, the Silk Road was moving something far more consequential than fabric. Silk was almost a secondary commodity by then, a premium export that funded the infrastructure. What the route was actually moving, wrapped inside bales of cloth, tucked inside diplomatic missions, hidden in the memories of traveling monks, was the operating system of every civilization it touched. China had maintained a state monopoly on silk production for nearly 3,000 years, with the punishment for revealing the secrets of sericulture being death. That monopoly finally broke in approximately 552 AD, when Byzantine Emperor Justinian III arranged for monks to smuggle silkworm eggs out of China hidden inside hollow walking staffs, one of the earliest documented acts of industrial espionage in recorded history. The moment the secret moved, the trade dynamic shifted. What replaced silk as the route's most valuable cargo was more abstract and more dangerous: the knowledge of how to produce, preserve, and govern wealth itself. Paper money, invented in China's Sichuan province around 960 AD, traveled west along trade routes before Europe independently developed the concept. Mathematical notation, astronomical tables, the techniques of papermaking and movable type printing, all of these flowed along the same corridors that moved pepper and porcelain. The merchants running those routes were not vendors. They were the venture capitalists of the pre-modern world, and the nodes they controlled determined which civilizations received the next century's technology and which ones waited. The Mongols, by unifying the route under the Pax Mongolica from 1206 to 1368, created the most open information corridor the pre-modern world had ever seen. Marco Polo traveled from Venice to Beijing. Knowledge moved in every direction simultaneously. And then, traveling the same open corridors, came Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the Black Death, which reached Europe in 1347 and killed between 30 and 60% of the population. The same infrastructure that delivered the Renaissance also delivered the worst demographic catastrophe in human history. If the Silk Road's most dangerous cargo was not plague, but the idea that an empire could control the flow of knowledge itself, the question that follows is an uncomfortable one. What would a modern Silk Road look like, and who is running it right now? The Vatican's forbidden portfolio. In 1832, the Rothschild banking family became the official financial manager of the Holy See. It was not the first time the Catholic Church had outsourced its financial operations, and it was not the beginning of the portfolio they were managing. By that point, the Vatican had been accumulating assets, land, art, gold, and information for approximately 1,500 years. What it had quietly constructed was the longest-running sovereign wealth fund in human history, and almost none of it appeared on any public ledger. The church's accumulation strategy was, in its basic architecture, identical to the approach used by the world's most sophisticated modern institutional investors. Acquire hard assets. Hold indefinitely. Never sell. Control the information that determines what everything is worth. The difference is that the Vatican ran this strategy before the concept of institutional investment existed, and it ran it with one additional asset no market has ever successfully priced: the authority to threaten secular rulers with excommunication if they interfered with church property. The Lateran Treaty of 1929, signed between Mussolini and Pope Pius X, gave the Vatican 750 million lire in cash, plus 1 billion lire in Italian state bonds as compensation for the loss of the Papal States. That payment became the founding capital of the Vatican's modern investment portfolio. The Church's art collection, the largest private collection in the world, has never been publicly appraised in full. Estimates for the appraised works alone range between $10 and $15 billion, with the unappraised holdings considered incomparable. The Vatican Secret Archive, now formally renamed the Apostolic Archive, holds 85 linear kilometers of shelving, and access remains restricted to credentialed researchers with approved research questions. The intellectual foundation of the Vatican's territorial claims for 600 years was a document called The Donation of Constantine, a text purportedly from Emperor Constantine, granting the Church authority over all Western lands. In 1440, the humanist scholar Lorenzo Valla proved it was a forgery using historical linguistics, the emerging science of textual analysis. The Church had been running the longest documented fraudulent title claim in investment history. When the forgery was exposed, the institution continued operating. The asset base was too large, the legal systems too entangled, and the spiritual authority too deeply embedded in European governance for the fraud to unwind anything. The most successful long-term investment portfolio in history was not built on compound interest. It was built on the one asset no market has ever been able to price: the fear of God. The Templar banking network that vanished overnight. On the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, King Philip IV of France executed the most precisely coordinated financial seizure in medieval history. Every Knight Templar in France was arrested simultaneously, the operation requiring years of secret planning and near-perfect information control. Philip was deeply in debt to the order and had decided that the most efficient way to resolve that debt was to destroy the creditor. But the thing he was really after, the Templar treasury, was never found. It has never been found. The Knights Templar were founded in 1119 AD, and within 200 years, they had built something that the medieval world had no framework to understand: an international banking network. A pilgrim could deposit gold in London, receive a coded document, and withdraw equivalent funds in Jerusalem without carrying a single coin across the bandit-infested roads of medieval Europe. That instrument, the letter of credit, was the proto-banking technology that eventually became the architecture of modern finance. The Templars operated it across an estimated 870 branch offices, called commanderies, spanning from England to the Holy Land. Philip IV's motive was not religious. It was financial. He was personally in debt to the Templars for the cost of his wars, and the papal suppression of the order in 1312, obtained through intense pressure on Pope Clement V, served as the legal mechanism for what was essentially a sovereign default by asset seizure. What Philip did not obtain was the treasury itself. The night before the arrests, 18 ships docked at the Templar port of La Rochelle were loaded and sailed northwest into the Atlantic. They were never recovered. Contemporary accounts noted the departure. No subsequent record accounts for their destination or cargo. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master, was burned at the stake in 1314. Historical records note that he reportedly cursed both Philip IV and Clement V before the flames took him. Both men were dead within the year. The curse is legend. The timeline is documented fact. 18 ships left La Rochelle the night before the most coordinated financial seizure in medieval history. They were never found. The question is not where the treasure went. The question is whether someone has been sitting on it ever since, and whether the banking infrastructure the Templars built simply continued operating under different names in different cities, which is exactly what the historical record of Swiss private banking, emerging in the same region, in the same century, quietly suggests. The terra nullius lie. The land that was always owned. The legal doctrine of terra nullius, meaning empty land, was not an oversight. It was a product, carefully engineered to make theft look like discovery. When European powers began colonizing the Americas, Australia, and Africa, the doctrine held that land without European-style property rights had no owner, and was therefore available for lawful claim. It was the most profitable legal fiction in human history, and it was applied to some of the most sophisticated land management systems ever developed. Australia's Aboriginal peoples had been managing the continent for approximately 65,000 years, a figure confirmed by archaeological evidence that makes it one of the longest continuous cultural traditions in human history. Their technique, controlled burning or fire stick farming, deliberately shaped the landscape, creating grasslands and forest edges that sustained both wildlife and agriculture across a continent the size of Europe. When British colonizers arrived and saw those open grasslands, they declared them natural wilderness. Terra nullius was declared. The land was empty. The people managing it were simply not performing management in a form the colonizers recognized. And so the management and the people were legally erased. The Amazon rainforest, long described as a pristine wilderness untouched by human settlement, contains evidence of extensive pre-Columbian urban networks. Geoglyphs covering thousands of square kilometers were discovered beginning in the 1980s and 90s as deforestation cleared the canopy. LiDAR surveys published in scientific literature revealed that the Khmer Empire of Angkor in Cambodia covered approximately 1,000 square kilometers, larger than any pre-industrial city in the world, with water management infrastructure of extraordinary sophistication. These were not primitive encampments. They were urban systems erased from the historical record because the people who built them were declared to have had no property rights. The Cherokee Nation, by 1828, had a written constitution, a bilingual newspaper called the Cherokee Phoenix, and a functioning democratic government. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 was passed the following year. Estimates of the total land asset transfer executed through terra nullius and equivalent doctrines across 3 centuries range into the tens of trillions of dollars in modern equivalent terms, a figure difficult to calculate precisely because the accounting was never meant to be done. The most valuable real estate investment in human history was not purchased, not developed, and not discovered. It was declared empty by the people who wanted it, and the owners were simply written out of the deed. The Nikola Tesla portfolio, the energy economy that was switched off. In 1899, in a laboratory in Colorado Springs, Nikola Tesla transmitted electricity through the Earth itself and reportedly lit 200 light bulbs wirelessly from 25 miles away. He called it the World System, a global network that would transmit both information and electrical power through the planet without wires, without meters, and without the infrastructure of centralized generation that the existing energy industry depended on entirely. 2 years later, his primary backer withdrew funding. The Wardenclyffe Tower was never completed. The World System never launched. Tesla held approximately 300 patents at his death in 1943, many related to wireless energy transmission and resonant circuits. The Wardenclyffe Tower, begun in 1901 on Long Island, New York, was designed to transmit power across the Atlantic. J.P. Morgan had provided the initial funding, an amount equivalent to approximately $5 million in modern terms. In 1903, after Guglielmo Marconi successfully transmitted a radio signal across the Atlantic, using equipment that incorporated Tesla's own patented designs. Morgan concluded the communications component of the Wardenclyffe project had been made redundant. He withdrew. What that withdrawal actually eliminated was not the communications function. It was the free energy function, the component for which no metering mechanism existed. Morgan reportedly asked Tesla a question that has since become one of the most consequential sentences in the history of technology. Where do I put the meter? The question was not rhetorical. It was a business decision. A system of wireless energy transmission had no choke point, no pipeline, no centralized distribution node at which a toll could be collected. The investment case for suppressing it was stronger than the investment case for building it, and that calculus determined the energy architecture of the entire 20th century. At Tesla's death, the Office of Alien Property seized all of his papers and equipment. Some documents were later released. Others remain classified. Wardenclyffe Tower was demolished in 1917, ostensibly to settle Tesla's hotel debts, while Tesla was still alive and attempting to raise alternative funding. You do not demolish a failed experiment. You demolish a viable one. You have decided the world should not see. Wireless charging, now embedded in hundreds of millions of consumer devices, operates on the principle of resonant inductive coupling, which is Tesla's principle, validated commercially 120 years after his funding was cut. The global fossil fuel industry's market capitalization exceeded $7 trillion in recent years. If the question Morgan asked in 1903 had been answered differently, that entire asset class might not exist. The Antikythera inheritance, the technology that wasn't supposed to exist. In 1900, a sponge diver named Elias Stadiatos surfaced off the coast of a small Greek island and reported finding a reef scattered with the remnants of an ancient shipwreck. Inside that wreck, archaeologists eventually recovered a corroded lump of bronze the size of a shoebox. It sat in a museum in Athens for 50 years before anyone understood what it was. When they finally did, it did not just complicate the historical record. It broke the model entirely. The Antikythera mechanism, dated to approximately 100 to 70 BC, is an analog computing device. It contains at least 37 interlocking bronze gears capable of predicting solar and lunar eclipses, tracking the positions of 5 planets, calculating the 4-year Olympiad cycle, and modeling the Saros cycle, the pattern by which eclipses repeat every 18 years. Nothing of comparable mechanical complexity appears in the historical record again until the astronomical clocks of 14th century Europe. That is a gap of approximately 1,400 years, during which humanity apparently forgot how to build the thing, and then slowly, painfully, reinvented it. X-ray tomography conducted by the Antikythera Mechanism Research Project in 2006 revealed approximately 3,500 characters of inscribed text on the device's interior surfaces, essentially a user manual, indicating it was designed to be operated by someone who did not build it. A reconstruction study published by University College London in 2021 revealed that the front display mechanism modeled a cosmological framework, combining Babylonian astronomical cycles with Greek geometric theory, a synthesis centuries ahead of any surviving written description of such an integration. The ship carrying the mechanism also held marble sculptures, bronze statues, and luxury glassware, suggesting it was transporting high-value cargo for an extremely wealthy patron who understood exactly what they were paying for. The gearing ratios encode the Metonic cycle, a 19-year alignment of solar and lunar calendars, the Saros eclipse cycle, and the Callipic cycle. Calculating those periods required centuries of systematic astronomical observation, which means the mechanism was not invented by its maker. It was the final product of an institutional tradition, a school or lineage of astronomers recording data across generations that left no other physical trace. The device is the last artifact of a scientific culture that was erased so completely that we did not know it existed until a sponge diver found it by accident in 60 meters of water. The Antikythera mechanism does not simply prove that someone built a computer 2,000 years ago. It proves that someone built a computer 2,000 years ago, and then everything they knew was lost. Human technological development was not a straight line of progress. It peaked, collapsed, and had to be rebuilt from below. We still do not know how far it fell, or what is still sitting at the bottom, waiting for the next diver who goes deep enough. What connects these 10 stories is not conspiracy. It is a pattern far more unsettling than any single act of suppression. Across 4,000 years and every inhabited continent, the most valuable assets in human history were not gold or land or spices. They were systems of knowledge, the copper trade routes that someone ran before history admits they existed, the astronomical tradition that produced a functioning computer and then vanished without a successor, the legal and spiritual architectures that turned information into monopoly, and monopoly into empire. In every case, the knowledge was either hidden, stolen, destroyed, or simply allowed to die with the people who held it, because the people in a position to preserve it understood that sharing it would cost them everything. The forbidden investments on this list were not forbidden because they were dangerous. They were forbidden because they were too valuable to share. If that pattern is still operating today, and the evidence suggests it is, then the most important question is not what we have lost. It is what we are being told does not exist yet. Subscribe and keep asking. Every century buries what the next one has to rediscover. The only difference between a forbidden investment and a lost civilization is how long it takes someone to start digging.